People think Transylvania is just dark forests and vampire myths, but that version of history is lazy, because long before fiction claimed its name, Transylvania was one of the most dangerous political experiments in Europe, a land trapped between empires that should not have survived at all, and yet it did. Not by power, not by conquest, but by learning how to exist in the narrow space between giants. Because for centuries, Transylvania was part of the Kingdom of Hungary, a frontier region guarded by nobles, Secli warriors, and Saxon settlers, stable as long as Hungary remained strong. But everything collapsed in 1526 at the Battle of Mohács, when the Hungarian army was destroyed in a single afternoon, and the king died on the battlefield, shattering the kingdom instantly. And from that chaos, Hungary split into three parts: the west under Habsburg control, the center under direct Ottoman rule, and the eastern lands that would become Transylvania, suddenly forced to survive alone. And this is where Transylvania's real story begins, because instead of being crushed immediately, it adapted, forming the Principality of Transylvania under John Zapolya and later his son John Sigismund, officially an Ottoman vassal but internally self-governing, paying tribute to Istanbul while refusing to surrender its identity, walking a constant tightrope where one wrong decision could mean invasion. And this balance shaped everything: its politics, its culture, and even its religion. Because while Europe burned over faith, Transylvania legalized multiple Christian denominations through the Edict of Torda in 1568, not out of idealism but survival, understanding that division would destroy the state from within. And this rare tolerance turned Transylvania into a strange exception in a violent age. But make no mistake, this was not a peaceful land. It supplied troops, fought rebellions, crushed internal rivals, and negotiated endlessly with both Vienna and Istanbul. Because independence here was never permanent, it was borrowed time, and every prince knew that survival mattered more than glory. And this mindset allowed Transylvania to exist when logic said it should disappear, setting the stage for a small principality to briefly matter in European politics despite being surrounded by forces far stronger than itself. Transylvania's survival was never guaranteed. It depended entirely on the skill of its rulers, because the principality was not protected by armies or wealth, but by timing, alliances, and constant negotiation. And the moment weak leadership appeared, the pressure from outside increased immediately, especially from the Habsburgs, who saw Transylvania not as a partner, but as unfinished business, a lost piece of Hungary that needed to be reclaimed. And this tension exploded at the start of the 17th century, when Habsburg control over Royal Hungary grew more aggressive, forcing Transylvanian nobles and soldiers into imperial wars while ignoring their autonomy. And this sparked the uprising of Stephen Bocskai, a noble who understood that open war with the Habsburgs alone was suicide, so he played the only card available: Ottoman support. But he used it carefully, framing his rebellion not as treason but as a defense of Hungarian and Transylvanian rights. And when his revolt succeeded, it sent a clear message across the region: Transylvania would resist absorption, even if it meant dealing with dangerous allies. And this resistance reached its peak under Gabriel Bethlen, the most capable prince Transylvania ever produced, a ruler who transformed a fragile buffer state into a serious political actor, aligning himself with Protestant powers during the 30 Years' War, marching into Royal Hungary, challenging Habsburg authority, and negotiating directly with European courts that normally ignored states of this size. And for a brief moment, Transylvania mattered. Not because it was strong, but because it was useful. Because Europe was divided, the Habsburgs were overstretched, and the Ottomans still needed a loyal buffer in the east. But this golden age was built on one man's ability to balance impossible forces. And once Bethlen died, the structure he held together began to crack, because Transylvania had no system to replace strong leadership,
only personalities. And as internal noble rivalries grew and Ottoman power slowly declined, the principality lost its room to maneuver. Its rulers were forced into deeper dependence, first on Istanbul, then increasingly under Habsburg influence. And the space that once allowed Transylvania to play both sides began to disappear, turning survival from a calculated strategy into a desperate struggle to delay the inevitable.
By the mid-17th century, the world around Transylvania was changing faster than it could adapt, because the Ottoman Empire, once the guarantor of its autonomy, was no longer expanding with the same force, while the Habsburgs were growing stronger, richer, and far more patient. And this shift was deadly for a state whose entire existence depended on balance, because buffer states survive only when both sides need them. And as Ottoman power weakened after repeated military failures, Transylvania's value as a semi-independent ally declined, and Vienna began to press harder, demanding loyalty, troops, and obedience rather than negotiation. And inside Transylvania, the situation was no better. Noble factions fought for control, princes rose and fell rapidly, and foreign powers interfered openly in successions, turning the principality into a political battleground rather than a sovereign state. And when the Great Turkish War erupted at the end of the century, Transylvania was trapped, unable to openly side with the Ottomans without inviting Habsburg invasion, and unable to resist Habsburg armies without external support that no longer existed. And as imperial forces advanced eastward, the old system collapsed. Transylvania was occupied, treaties were imposed, and its autonomy was reduced piece by piece, not through a single conquest, but through administrative control, military presence, and legal absorption. And by the time the Ottomans were pushed back decisively, Transylvania was no longer a principality in any meaningful sense. It was a Habsburg-ruled territory, governed by imperial officials who promised stability but delivered centralization, taxation, and cultural pressure. And yet, even in defeat, Transylvania did not disappear quietly, because the habits formed during centuries of semi-independence, negotiation, and resistance did not vanish with the loss of sovereignty. They shifted into a new form, one that would define the region for centuries to come.
Habsburg rule did not arrive as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow, tightening grip, because Vienna understood that force alone would keep Transylvania unstable, so it relied on administration, law, and military presence to reshape the region from the inside, keeping local nobles on imperial payrolls, stationing troops in key towns, and slowly integrating Transylvania into the broader structure of the empire, while still allowing it to exist on paper as a separate entity. And this illusion of autonomy mattered because it reduced resistance, even as real power shifted away from local rulers. And religious tolerance, once a necessity for survival, became a point of friction as Catholic influence expanded under imperial pressure, challenging the Protestant balance that had defined Transylvanian society. And this tension sparked one last major resistance, led by Francis II Rákóczi in the early 18th century, a rebellion fueled by frustration with taxation, forced conscription, and the loss of traditional rights. And for a moment, it looked like history might repeat itself, like Transylvania could once again slip free through chaos. But the balance was gone. The Ottomans could no longer intervene, European powers were focused elsewhere, and the rebellion failed. Not because it lacked courage, but because the world that once allowed Transylvania to survive no longer existed. And after this defeat, the region was fully absorbed into the Habsburg system, governed more directly, economically exploited, and culturally reshaped. Yet despite this, Transylvania remained distinct, its mixed population of Hungarians, Romanians, Saxons, and Shekelis preserving their languages, traditions, and grievances, creating a layered identity that imperial rule could control but never fully unify. And this unresolved tension would later explode in new forms, because the end of political independence did not end the story. It only pushed it underground.
As the 18th century turned into the 19th, Transylvania's struggle shifted from princes and armies to identity and nationalism because imperial rule suppressed open rebellion but could not suppress memory. and the different peoples of the region began to imagine Transylvania in competing ways. Hungarians saw it as an inseparable part of the Hungarian nation unjustly constrained by Vienna. Romanians, who formed a growing majority of the population, began to demand recognition, rights, and political voice, while the Saxons fought to protect their historic privileges, and the Habsburg Empire, fearing fragmentation, responded with centralization, censorship, and military force. And this tension finally erupted during the revolutions of 1848, when Transylvania became a battleground not just against imperial power, but between national movements themselves, turning former allies into enemies. And the failure of these revolutions led to harsher control, but also deeper political awareness. And when Austria-Hungary was created in 1867, Transylvania was absorbed directly into the Hungarian half of the empire, ending even its symbolic separateness, triggering policies of Magyarization that pushed Hungarian language and culture at the expense of others, increasing resentment, especially among Romanians. And by the early 20th century, Transylvania was no longer a buffer between empires. It was a pressure cooker inside one, its future tied to forces far beyond its borders, waiting for the next great collapse to determine its fate.
That collapse came with the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated under military defeat and internal fracture, and once again Transylvania found itself in a familiar position, caught in a power vacuum where history moved faster than people could react, and as imperial authority vanished, national movements rushed to claim the land, and in 1918 Transylvania was united with Romania, a decision celebrated by Romanians as liberation and mourned by Hungarians as loss, because borders changed overnight, but populations did not, leaving millions suddenly on the wrong side of history. And the Treaty of Trianon in 1920 confirmed this new reality, permanently redrawing Central Europe and turning Transylvania from a multi-ethnic imperial province into a central symbol of national identity. And the interwar period brought land reforms, cultural shifts, and political tension, as Romania worked to integrate the region while minorities struggled to adapt. And though the state changed, the old fractures remained. And during the Second World War, those fractures were reopened when northern Transylvania was temporarily returned to Hungary under Axis arbitration, only to be taken back by Romania after the war, repeating the familiar cycle of occupation, adjustment, and resentment. And by the time communist rule settled over Eastern Europe, Transylvania's political fate was sealed, but its identity remained unresolved, shaped by centuries of survival, compromise, and loss.
Transylvania today feels calm compared to its past, but that calm is deceptive because history there never ended, it only slowed down, visible in architecture, language, and the quiet lines that still divide memory as medieval Saxon towns sit beside Romanian villages and Hungarian churches, each carrying a version of the same land story. And this coexistence is not accidental. It is the result of centuries of forced compromise where no single group ever fully won. And that is the most honest way to understand Transylvania, not as a lost kingdom or stolen land, but as a place permanently shaped by negotiation, where survival depended on knowing when to resist and when to adapt. And even now, debates over autonomy, heritage, and identity echo the same arguments once made by princes trying to balance Vienna and Istanbul, because the forces are different, but the pressure is familiar. And this continuity is what makes Transylvania unique, a region whose importance was never about size or power, but about position, standing at the crossroads of Europe, absorbing influence without losing itself entirely. And when people reduce it to myth, they miss the real lesson, that history's most resilient places are often the ones that were never allowed to be simple. And Transylvania's endurance, more than any legend, is what truly defines it.
What makes Transylvania uncomfortable for historians and politicians alike is that it refuses to belong cleanly to one narrative, because every empire that touched it left something behind but never fully claimed it. and every nation that later inherited it had to deal with layers they could not erase, which is why arguments about Transylvania are never really about borders. They are about memory, about whose suffering counts, whose culture feels threatened, and whose version of history feels ignored. And this tension exists precisely because Transylvania was never built as a nation-state. It was a survival state, designed to function in uncertainty, where compromise was not weakness, but strategy. And when modern nationalism arrived, it struggled to fit a land that had learned to live without absolutes, creating friction that still appears in politics, education, and identity debates today, not as open conflict, but as quiet resistance, because people there inherited the instinct to endure rather than dominate, an instinct shaped long before modern flags existed.
So when Transylvania is remembered only through castles and myths, something important is lost. Because its real story is not about horror or fantasy, it is about a region that mastered the art of not disappearing, surviving centuries of pressure from stronger powers by staying adaptable, divided yet functional, vulnerable yet persistent. And this is why Transylvania still matters, not because it rules anything, but because it proves that history is not only shaped by empires and victories, it is shaped by places that endure without winning, that absorb loss without collapsing, and that carry their past forward quietly. And in that sense, Transylvania never truly fell. It simply learned how to exist in a world that was always trying to claim it.